On October 30th, 1975, New York newspaper The Daily News printed what would become one of the most famous front pages in the history of American journalism. Summing up the refusal of the then President of the United States to offer the then bankrupt New York a federal bailout, the headline read, "Ford to City, Drop Dead." So Donald Trump is not the first US president to pick fights with America's big cities, though he is doing it with unusual enthusiasm. In the United States, as elsewhere, big cities tend towards the politically liberal and generally inclusive. Conservatives and nationalists, such as President Trump, generally pile up their votes in the small towns and rural provinces. The divide was spotted at least a century ago by that peerless chronicler of the American condition, H.L. Mencken, who ascribed it to what he called the yokel's congenital and incurable hatred of the city man, his simian rage against everyone who, as he sees it, is having a better time than he is. And at several points in America's tempestuous history, presidents have decided, as Trump now has, that local law enforcement is insufficient to deal with the municipal tumult of the moment, and called out not just the National Guard, but federal troops. This is not exclusively a predilection of Republicans. Lyndon Johnson sent the U.S. Army into Detroit in 1967 to confront rioters. And Republicans don't even always do it for illiberal reasons. Dwight Eisenhower deployed the 101st Airborne to Little Rock in 1957 to ensure that 9 black kids were able to attend a recently desegregated school. In recent weeks, President Trump has activated the National Guard in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., and is threatening much more of this kind of thing. What is the president hoping to accomplish? How can a big city mayor prepare for it? And why has conflict between the White House and city halls been such a motif of American history? This is the Foreign Desk.
There's very much a view that this is a test case, that Trump is trying to condition residents to a more autocratic use of the military.
Now you have a nationwide bit of fascism, candidly, that I think is creating a difficult moment for Americans and American leaders.
A lot of us are very terrified that Donald Trump will take advantage of that disturbance in a Reichstag fire kind of way and do something like declare martial law.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Ashley Parker, staff writer at The Atlantic and senior political analyst at MSNBC. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Ashley, first of all, give us an idea of what D.C. looks like right now. How prominent are the troops who have been deployed, and is it entirely clear who they actually are?
So this is the thing that's complicated. The National Guard, in many ways, has become the face of all of the troops that have been deployed in D.C., but it's the National Guard, it's ICE, it's Trump sort of taking control of the D.C. police, it's other national law enforcement organizations. But to give you a sense, I took the metro to work today, and when I got off at my work metro stop, I saw more than a dozen members of the National Guard just kind of milling about.
Which is a partial answer to one of the questions we wanted to ask, which is, as far as it's possible to tell, other than milling about, what are they actually doing all day?
So, if you ask them, which I have, one of them described themselves to me as the president's patrol. Someone else said just smiling and waving. But, sort of the most generous answer that they have given is that they are here so that the DC police can be deployed elsewhere to fight crime, essentially. But what they are actually doing, and they've put this out in press releases, so it's not a secret, they're working on beautification projects. So we have seen them by the National Mall with wheelbarrows spreading mulch. My 14-year-old daughter, while I was working on a story on the National Guard, I happened to look at her Instagram, and she happened to be wearing a camouflage crop top. and she had posed for a thumbs up picture with a fellow member of the National Guard and captioned it "twinsies," right? So they're sort of a tourist attraction. Someone else told me about, being near the White House, where you have a lot of sort of these ice cream trucks that are parked, good humor trucks. And they saw this kind of incongruous image of the National Guard, with their rifles slung on one side and their guns and, soft serve in their hands. So they're around the city. They are a very visible presence. Sometimes just them being there is deterrent. It has not really been necessarily deterrent of major crimes as much as it has been. A number of people have reported, I myself have witnessed and reported, fare jumping on the subway has stopped when you see National Guard in the station. Union Station, which often smells like marijuana, I watched someone come up to the National Guard and thank them for being there and say, look, it normally smells like pot smoke, and since you've been here, the air doesn't smell that way. And that's true. So they are in certain ways having a deterrent effect. But I also reported an incident of a stabbing in broad daylight on a busy intersection in Northeast Washington, where 3 members of the National Guard were dining al fresco across the street. And not only was it not deterrent, but the suspect got away. So it's complicated, is the short answer.
But does it feel noticeably different to residents of DC in particular? Because you're not unaccustomed to seeing a large security presence on the street. If there's an event like, I was there last summer for the NATO summit, and there were soldiers and Humvees and armoured vehicles everywhere. So I guess there's a threshold for DC residents. But does this feel different to that?
Yeah, it feels demonstrably different because DC is not used to having the National Guard stationed throughout the city in non-emergency moments. DC residents are very used to, as you pointed out, depending on where you live, for instance, seeing the vice president's motorcade coming down Massachusetts Avenue just about every single day, or visiting dignitaries in the security and motorcades that come with that. But seeing National Guard on your streets, in your metro stations, feels different. And then there's other kind of secondary effects to this, which is, depending on the neighborhood, because the National Guard and ICE and just sort of this military presence in the city has such a chilling effect on, for instance, not just people who are here and are undocumented, but people who are here, sometimes with temporary protected status in areas that are heavily Latino areas. The restaurants are far less crowded. The playgrounds are less crowded. Some parents are afraid to drop their kids off at school. So, they're arranging carpools. You saw footage of kids having to push through the National Guard on their first day of school. If you're a resident in any corner of the city and you're ordering delivery, often delivery times are getting longer because there's less delivery drivers. People who feel comfortable being out in the city because of checkpoints, being out late at night. And then another thing, you're hearing people talk about, and there's sort of two tiers here. And there's one group of people who are sort of the employers who are talking about their nanny didn't feel comfortable showing up, or their house cleaners have canceled. And for them, it's an inconvenience, right? They're in a privileged position. But what that really belies is for these people, the house cleaners and the nannies and the contractors, what that's really reflective of is not an inconvenience, but a deep-seated sense of fear and menace that is causing them to sort of, at least for now, abandon their livelihoods to try to wait out this military presence.
So is the concern now, if we look at this more broadly, that this is what President Trump is thinking of as a test run, that this is what he wants to roll out to other big American cities, especially big American cities which tend to vote Democrat?
Yeah, there's very much a view that this is a test case, that Trump is trying to move towards using the military for policing, that he is trying to condition residents to sort of a more autocratic use of the military. That's a concern, though. The one that he talks about going into Chicago next, going into Baltimore, going back into California, It's worth noting, though, and that's not to say he won't try to do it, but DC, of course, is in a very unique and in certain ways more helpless situation, being not a state, right? So DC is beholden to the federal government in ways that states are not. States have a lot more rights and recourse to push back. And not only is he going into these blue cities, right? Cities that vote Democratic. But in those three cities I just mentioned, they are in states where the state's governor, Gavin Newsom, J.B. Pritzker, Wes Moore in Maryland, are all likely to potentially run for president as Democrats in 2028. So in these other states, there's a real political element too, where these governors have a real political incentive to stand up to Trump in a way that Mayor Bowser in D.C. does not.
Ashley Parker, staff writer at The Atlantic, thanks for joining us. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. It is at least arguable that President Trump's real target is not so much America's big cities as the mayors of those big cities. We're joined now by one of them, Quinton Lucas, mayor of Kansas City. Mr. Mayor, you will doubtless have heard Caroline Leavitt, the White House spokesperson this week, talking about the deployment of the National Guard in Washington, D.C., and saying, quote, the president would love to do this in every Democrat-run city across the country. That obviously includes your city. How concerned are you by that prospect?
I think the president is still more of a showman and an entertainer than he has any interest in substance. And my view has been that the president is picking on the largest cities in America first. That's why you've heard discussion of Los Angeles and Chicago. Does he get to every Democratic city? I don't think there are enough National Guardsmen. I don't think there's enough energy and interest to do so. So we are operating day in and day out. And last week, I met with a group of Black mayors in America. You'll note that of the cities that have been attacked or under his interest, almost all of them have been run by a Black mayor.
I was about to ask if you noticed a pattern emerging there.
Yes, and I think we've all seen that. I talked to the mayor of Los Angeles last week, Karen Bass, who was noting that. We think we are getting picked on. You're hearing that now. And so, look, it is a broader concern, but I would say this very simply. They create very serious concerns, but they're not serious people. And so I do think the president will deploy on a whim. That being said, trying to predict what Donald Trump will do is in some ways like watching a play that I once enjoyed, The Madness of King George. And I think, frankly, that's what we're seeing in the U.S. now.
I mean, do you have a plan or contingency in place in case one day President Trump does wake up and decide, you know what, I'm sending the National Guard and or federal troops to Kansas City?
I already have started a process. I think last week I was on the cover of a fairly popular American daily, the New York Times, talking about how we do welcome cooperation. We do welcome collaboration with the FBI, with our drug enforcement agency getting fentanyl off of our streets, with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms that is helping us get illegal guns off of America's street. That is the collaboration we want. So what we're really trying to do is say, rather than sending us National Guard, send us agencies that are helping our communities stay safe, fighting human trafficking, fighting drug trafficking. Whether that is effective long-term, one does not know, but thus far we have not gotten the attention and interest of the President of the United States.
But it is your contention that the President and his administration are not actually interested in doing anything that will actually help, that they just want to create a spectacle?
Correct. I mean, yes, absolutely. You've probably seen the pictures, and it is astonishing. If you have never been to the National Mall in Washington, D.C. in the United States, it is both beautiful and also one of the safest places you could always be in America. And we have National Guardsmen in Army fatigues with M15s and others who are standing around the Lincoln Monument, the Washington Monument, who are walking around the National Mall. This is something that is not a sustained difference maker. Now, I know they're pushing information through particularly right-wing news sources that are looking at the arrests that they're having and others. Those arrests include incredibly petty offenses. Those arrests are basically high in number, many of which immigration related as well. But I don't think that any American mayor believes that having a National Guardsman stand around the fanciest monument in your community is going to actually mean that you are solving long systemic organized crime.
I want to go back to that point you were making about how he seems especially fixated not just on Democrat-run cities, but Democrat-run cities with black mayors. Does that strike you as something that he just perceives as electorally advantageous, or are you concerned that there's something more visceral and perhaps sinister going on there?
I think it is just electorally advantageous. I will say this. I think Donald Trump is a man who was captured in 1985 in almost everything that he does, right? The gaudy gold, the Cold War that lives in his world, although he quite likes Russia. And I think his same view of the urban community. The New York City that he knows is the gritty New York City of the 1970s and 80s. It's a New York where blacks were, I think, openly seen as threats, and that is the rhetoric in which he exists and operates. It is not in any way reflective of the New York of today, a city that used to have 2,000 homicides a year and now is down to about 500. It's not reflective of integrated and diverse communities. And I think that is something that is inherent to who he is. I think that is something that is the inherent bias that he has. I'm not sure, however, if he's waking up saying, I want to be racist each day. I just think it's natural for him.
I mean, do you have a different relationship? I mean, I guess it must be a closer relationship with Missouri's governor, who is a Republican, Mike Kehoe. You have been unhappy with him publicly about a few things, calling out the National Guard before anti-Trump protests in June. Is dealing with a Republican governor any kind of dress rehearsal for dealing with this federal administration, or is this federal administration something so completely different and bizarre that that doesn't help?
It is a good question. The biggest challenge in America right now isn't actually Donald Trump himself. It is his foot soldiers. It is people like Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert Kennedy Jr., and it is the governors around the country. Our relationship with our governor is a good one. That being said, when Trump barks, most Republicans in America throughout the states listen. And when he says jump, they all ask, how high? And so for me, probably the greatest challenge is getting through to our governor and saying, but our city actually needs this. We need guns off the streets. We need access to vaccines to make sure that we don't have a spread of polio, of all things, generations after it's largely been eradicated in the United States. And that is where I think we have the greatest concerns. And I would say this about my governor and many others. They're good to work with. They're closer to us. They visit our cities. But they still, I think, are far more adherent to Trump than they are the people of our cities.
But other than the specter of the National Guard or other troops being deployed on your streets, whether you like it or not, does the volatility, I guess, that you were talking about of Donald Trump affect your job at a day-to-day level? Does it make it any more or less difficult?
It makes it more difficult every day. Donald Trump has made it more difficult for us to get school kids vaccinated before they return to school this August. Donald Trump has made it more difficult for us to be able to actually get cooperation, particularly out of our immigrant populations, who are all horrified that ICE is coming down, even if there is someone who's taking advantage of our immigrant communities, Mexican, Haitian American, and a number of others. I mean, it makes it clearly more difficult for a few reasons. One, for what they actually do. But the second, for how Trump has taken over American politics in a way that is almost astonishing. When Barack Obama was in office, you didn't have to see him on the news every day, even if you were a voracious consumer of news. And I actually think it's the same. And I was in Europe this summer. I think it's the same for people elsewhere in the world, too. Donald Trump loves to fill the space and loves to be the center of the narrative. He goes to the U.S. Open tennis tournament. He is everywhere. So therefore, every institution is reacting to him and is responding to him. The people of America, many of whom who are not on his side, are scared. Doctors, hospitals, agencies, and others are adjusting practices for fear of cuts of the American Medicaid system, our national health insurance system. And more than anything, I think we are all concerned with elimination of programs that exist in America. I have lost staff members because of President Trump and his administration. We have lost millions of dollars because of this administration. So it is an everyday reality in terms of dealing with them.
Well, just finally then, there could be another 3.5 years of Donald Trump's second term still to go. Do you and other mayors you've spoken to in similar positions talk about long-term plans for dealing with this, long-term plans for trying to address those concerns you were talking about, despite Washington, D.C.? Or, again, is this presidency so volatile that there's no point in trying to plan for anything?
You come up with long-term plans. You come up with long-term plans in terms of how you can have funding sources in states with Democratic governors, which I am not one. You have had people who build out a real apparatus for homelessness support, for example, and healthcare funding. Those are the long-term plans. But the rest of us, I think, are riding a bit of a shockwave. It is a roller coaster in Donald Trump's America. The problem is it's a roller coaster without a seatbelt. And so you're hoping that physics keep you on board, but unfortunately, the wrong turn may throw you off, and you see that happen to real American communities, a challenge to American mayors. And I think it is fair to say that a number of Americans, but not greater than half, are horrified at this current moment. I have not seen this level of divisiveness in our country in quite some time. And I even argue, compared to the civil rights era, where most people actually knew what was happening was wrong. Just so that the people who were in charge of most of the abuses lived in one part of our country. Now you have a nationwide bit of fascism, candidly, that I think is creating a difficult moment for Americans and American leaders.
And there has been a lot of talk, more than you might want to think, about overseas, about where is a coherent opposition to President Trump. Do you think it's something that might grow out of that network of Democratic mayors?
It likely does, either mayors or governors. It will be a non-Washington based type of spirit of influence. I think right now, I looked at polling actually earlier today. We are not that popular as Democrats broadly, but I do think that individual leaders in states and cities are. It will need those types of people who have messages of how they actually get things done, rather than Washington that just debates, that I think does make a difference long-term for us.
Quinton Lucas, Mayor of Kansas City, thank you very much for joining us on the Foreign Desk. You're listening to the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. For a look at the long history of American national leaders telling American municipal leaders how to do their jobs, our final guest is Rick Perlstein, historian, journalist and author most recently of Reaganland, America's Right Turn. Rick, first of all, is there something especially attractive for Republican administrations in Washington to beat up on the big cities, such as the one that you're speaking to us from, Chicago, which traditionally tend a bit Democrat?
Well, the rural-urban contradiction, shall we say, is one of the drivers of world history, not just American history. And, the idea that cities are these dirty places where brown people live, right? And, they steal your innocent daughter and that sort of thing is part of American cultural and political history. And that, in fact, is what's driving a lot of this. When you see these videos of these big, beefy, thuggish men with the masks on their face, we don't really know who they are, right?
This is ICE you're talking about.
Right. But, dollars to donuts, these are guys from these rural areas who grew up, right, distrusting cities, sometimes for racist reasons. And, during the MAGA era have just been, drowned in propaganda that cities are, to use Donald Trump's term for Chicago, hellholes. And it's a very combustible situation because here are these armed agents of the state confronting people who don't want them to be there, right, are often surrounded by kind of almost like swarms of people saying, you're not welcome here, you're fascists, don't do this. And, hopefully it doesn't end in something tragic.
But is that dynamic there that you mentioned, the rural-urban tension, is that something that conservatives in particular have always leveraged for political gain in the United States, or is Donald Trump's variant on that something entirely new?
It's much more explicit now. With so much of Donald Trump, he takes things that have long roots in American history and he just jacks them up and he goes nuclear on them. But, I wasn't just, Donald Trump, his rival for the 2020 nomination, just to give an example. The governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, illustrated his point that American cities are unlivable, and implicitly require some sort of, federal intervention. He held up a map that he purported to was a map of everywhere a homeless person had defecated in the streets of San Francisco. And of course, it was just this mass of brown. And that's the propaganda image that a lot of Americans who watch Fox News or listen to talk radio have in their head about these beautiful, productive, functional cities across the country. A lot of this comes out of the movement in 2020 when we had racial justice protests that swept across America. And there was a very small amount of arson in the city of Portland, right? And it became just an article of faith in right-wing media that just you would hear people say the entire city of Portland had been, burned down by radicals. And, what we've been seeing here in Chicago is, people are just posting photographs of, videos of ordinary life in what is in fact a beautiful, civil, lovely, orderly city in which, like all cities all across America, crime has been going down almost precipitously in the last few years.
But does that approach, do you think, clearly it has made an amount of sense over the trip for American conservatives because it has helped them win elections. But is that always going to work? Because more and more Americans live in cities. And I know the Electoral College means that not everybody's vote counts entirely the same in presidential elections. But is this ultimately going to become a self-defeating strategy?
Well, any question that involves coalitions within democratic elections, right? There are more voters who want X than want Y, are really up in the air right now because so much of what the Republicans are doing takes into account exactly what you're saying, that they're going to be diminishing returns for this. So they're, cutting off the actual operations of democracy, right? A lot of what you're hearing, for example, in states like Texas, in Missouri, in Indiana, is they are trying to, basically turn their states into rotten boroughs to guarantee Republican results in elections, right? So yes, it's absolutely true. Not only is it true in terms of diminishing returns because, rural areas are less populated all the time. It's true economically. Every liberal can cite statistics to tell you that basically what we call blue America, which is places that vote for Democrats, economically subsidize red America, right? And, that's the tragedy of all this. We need each other. We're a nation, right? Urban and rural both have things to contribute to a functioning Commonwealth. Unfortunately, less and less the case that we have a functioning Commonwealth right now.
How concerned are you about where this could go? Because there are precedents in American history, obviously, of federal troops being sent into cities. You can go all the way back to, I guess, Abraham Lincoln sending in the soldiers from Gettysburg to quell draft riots in New York in 1863, or Lyndon Johnson sending the 82nd and 101st Airborne to Detroit in 1967. These things have happened, and obviously not exclusively Republican administrations have done it. But again, do you anticipate or, I guess, fear something entirely new in this realm from the current administration?
No, I fear precedents repeating themselves, but as usual in the Trump era, metastasizing to much greater size. And here, I would look at the times when what you said, federal troops, it's a complicated situation. When they say National Guard troops, these are not professional soldiers. These are what are known as, kind of a bit disparagingly, weekend warriors. They are militias, right, that are generally run by states. And they're guys who spend a weekend a month training. And they're training for, action in military situations, not urban policing situations. They're untrained. They're often rural. They're often scared. And the precedent is when National Guard troops were sent to cities in the 60s that had racial disturbances. And in my book, Nixonland, I write about these guys burning out the barrels of their rifles because they thought they saw a sniper, when the sniper was really someone on the other block burning out the barrel of his rifle because he saw a sniper. And the apotheosis of this was on May 4th, 1970, when some of these troops who had been part of those kinds of terrifying operations, these weekend warriors who were often, just in their early 20s, showed up on a United States campus called Kent State University. And they faced anti-war protesters and got terrified and shot 4 of them dead. So it's very easy to see this escalating into something very violent. And the fillip for this is, once that happens, a lot of us are very terrified that Donald Trump will take advantage of that disturbance in a Reichstag fire kind of way and do something like declare martial law. Some people say they're terrified that he would cancel elections. I don't think that would happen, but I think he would use it to his advantage because he's an authoritarian. He's a fascist. And, the news that, in fact, it seems that a popular resistance in Chicago on the ground to troops coming into our city has caused them to cancel their plans. So, it's one of these movements that you read about in history books. We're really on the knife's edge between something very terrifying and hopefully something redemptive.
Well, just finally then, your observation there that you don't think they'd cancel elections, where does your confidence come from for that?
Well, quite simply that they may not have to. I mean, it just in the same way Putin has elections and Hungary has elections. It's not beyond the wit of man to formally have an election while still kind of guaranteeing their outcome.
That was Rick Perlstein, author of many excellent books, most recently Reaganland, America's Right Turn. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.